Right now, I'm happy to be joined by former Senator Tom Coburn of the great state of Oklahoma. Senator Coburn, when I married Jack Dake's daughter Meredith last year, one thing I had to learn was all the senators from Oklahoma and to be nice to all of them. So this is going to be a really easy one for you.
Well, that's great. My regards to Meredith.
Thank you for that. Senator Coburn, I'm very excited about your book with regard to its focus on an Article 5 convention, a convention of the states. Our listeners listen to Mark Levin every night from 6 to 9, so they're pretty well versed, although I would love to start at the beginning on this. And by the way, the book is called Smashing the D.C. Monopoly, Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom and Stop America's Runaway Government. Tell us in briefly as possible, what exactly would an Article 5 convention look like, and what would be the goals of that convention?
Well, it would look like, first of all, the mechanism to get there, you have to have 34 states agree that we need to have that, and they have to be in agreement on what will be discussed. But once you get there, then what you would look at the three areas that we're filing on. One is fiscal responsibility. In other words, force the federal government to live within its means, make them have a balanced budget amendment. But that by itself doesn't work, because what they'll do is they'll transfer from the federal government unfunded mandates to the states. So just having a balanced budget amendment won't fix it. You have to limit the scope and jurisdiction of the federal government and have them back in the place where our founders intended them to be, small but strong, but limited in their encroachment on individual rights and freedom and choices about that freedom made at the state level. And then finally limit the terms of both appointed and elected officials. So if you did those three things, you could actually move us back into a direction where we might have a future for our millennial kids and grandkids and not hang them with $130 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities.
Now, I would love to get into some of the specifics that you just laid out there and what the ramifications would be if these amendments actually got passed by the convention. But let's step back for a moment about this process, because I think a lot of people don't quite understand what the process would be. This is something that's been laid out in the Constitution. That's why it's called Article 5. It's there in Article 5. Exactly what is the process to create this convention?
The process to create it is 2/3 of the states have to make a request through a joint resolution of their houses of government. For example, in Nebraska, it would just be the Senate, but in every other state, it'd be both their House and their Senate, to request that the Congress call a meeting of the states to consider limited amendments to the Constitution. And
I think you keep saying limited amendments and agreeing on what the agenda would be or what those amendments would be ahead of time. And I think that preempts what a lot of people's concerns are. A lot of people say, you don't want to have an Article 5 convention because once you convene it, the liberals will take over, the lefties will take over, and they'll do away with the Second Amendment. Well, that's not in the cards, is it?
No, it's not. But just remember, the Congress can do that right now. The controlling factor on amendments to the Constitution are the 38 states that are required to ratify. So what comes out of an Article 5 amendments convention is simply recommendations to the states that we think you ought to pass this. If 38 pass it, it becomes an amendment to the Constitution. If 38 don't. So taking it in reverse, let's say that the Congress passed today with 2/3 of each house an amendment to take away the Second Amendment. All it requires is 13 judiciary chairmen of 13 states to say, we're not doing that. It's over.
I see. Which is sort of what we saw with the Equal Rights Amendment, basically.
Yeah, it's all what we're hearing in opposition to this is fear, not based on fact, but fear based on the fact that the elites might lose control. And what our whole goal is to return power to the average citizen.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. Is the idea is the elites would lose control. That's sort of they're fearing the right thing here, basically.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we want, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or a liberal or a conservative, you ought to be the person deciding for you and your family, not some bureaucrat located in Washington, D.C.
Other critics of Article 5 conventions, even some conservative critics, they often point to Madison. It's funny how a lot of these people they ignore Madison when he doesn't agree with them. But they claim in the Federalist Papers or maybe at the Constitutional Convention, Madison was not real happy about the idea of an Article 5 convention.
Oh, that's not true at all.
Okay.
Actually, in his notes, he noted that this was the only thing that they considered as far as the states being able to offer amendments that wasn't vigorously argued. It was unanimous that the states ought to have. And the reason they said that is because they knew no place in history where a central government voluntarily ceded its power back to its citizens. So that it isn't true that Madison was in opposition to it. He was too busy taking notes, and he had concurred with it.
And one of the other arguments they have is, since it's never been done before, there's no precedent, there's no format, there's no way to know exactly how to go about doing this, because the Article 5 is a little bit vague in terms of the what would constitute a quorum, what would the process be. Has that been thought through?
Yeah, it has, and actually last year we did a mock convention where we had at least 2 representatives from every state come to Williamsburg and go through this process. And it's not hard. They'll use the rules of legislatures. Anything that's outside the scope will get knocked down on a point of order. And so it's not a hard thing to do. Matter of fact, the Bill of Rights came about because Madison and Jay were starting to get ready to call a convention of states to have the Bill of Rights considered. And Congress responded by passing it before they could get the votes to have it. Prior to our Constitution, almost every state and regional areas throughout our young country used conventions with which to change things. So it's not a process, and I'm sure our founders thought we would have used it 100 years ago, but we didn't. But they gave us this tool for a time just like we face today.
We're speaking with former Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, and it is a little distracting. You do sound just like my father-in-law. That Oklahoma accent is fantastic.
Well,
his brand new book, Smashing the D.C. Monopoly, Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom and Stop America's Runaway Government. I do want to get into the specifics here. Now, you talked about a lot of things here. Let's start with the balanced budget and also limiting the kind of burdens they can put on states. How is that to be worded in such a way that keeps the congressman in check? Because it seems like they're always able to pull out the Commerce Clause or something to be able to rewrite the Constitution at the Supreme Court level.
Well, that's exactly why in the scope and jurisdiction one of the things we would do would be to limit the Commerce Clause and restore it to what our founders intended it to be. Matter of fact, it was during the 30s was when the case actually came across against a guy by the name of Filbert in Ohio, who actually grew 18 acres too much wheat. And the opinion by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision was, because you didn't buy it in commerce, it's therefore commerce because you raised some outside of your quota.
Yeah.
So we saw this expansion, and that's the tool that every federal government agency uses to, in fact, tell you what to do in every state in the country. Even though it's state money, they direct how you will do it because they're utilizing the Commerce Clause to actually take away freedom from your state legislatures.
Now, what do you say to people who say, listen, this whole idea of putting power back in the hands of the people and draining the swamp in Washington and reducing the federal government's scope and power and a lot of the populist messages that come along with an Article 5 convention movement? Well, we got Trump in the White House now, and we don't need the Article 5 now because Trump's going to handle all those things.
Well, that's exactly why we don't want factionalization. We don't want to swing back and forth. That's the argument of why you want a 60 vote threshold in the Senate, because you want things hard. Our founders wanted our country to be where you could have stable thought and stable plans. And every time you had an election, they didn't want things changing back and forth. So the whole idea behind what we're doing is not to drain the swamp. It's to put muzzles on the alligators and limit their ability to take away our freedom and our choice.
How realistic is this movement? How many states so far has signed on to this?
12 states have already passed resolutions. It's filed in the other 38 states. It's passed one of the other house in an additional 17. So you can see we're getting close. And I expect in probably the next 2 or 3 years, we'll have the 34 states that are required to actually limit the imposition of elitism on the average American.
You know, so many things in our country are referred to by talking heads on television as unprecedented and historic, but this really would be a remarkable event, an Article 5 convention. How when you had your mock convention, Senator Coburn, what was the process like? I mean, did you elect a president of the convention as they did back in the 18th century with George Washington presiding?
Yeah, they did. They elected a president. It was a guy from Utah that was a state senator. They created a set of rules and adopted a legislative rule book, much similar to what is used in many of the legislators around. They assigned committees and broke into committees in different areas among these three areas that I've outlined to you. And then they brought forth amendments that were debated and voted on the floor of the mock convention. Now, granted, this only happened over a day and a half, so it was hard to see. What was interesting to me in observing this, and all I did was observe. I didn't participate. I didn't say anything. What I did was observe. As you could see, that people were there, and there were liberals there and conservatives. What they want to get back to saying who actually gets to decide in this country. Is it unelected people who work for the federal government? Or should it be your state legislators where you can actually go and influence them versus somebody in Washington far, far away that you can't influence at all?
That is the fundamental core of this discussion, isn't it? And as soon as it comes back to that, I think that it really does bring it all into perspective. Our guest is former U.S. Senator Tom Coburn, and I wonder if you could just, as we finish their conversation up about your new book about an Article 5 convention and the movement behind it, how much is your opinion on this motivated by your 10 years in the U.S. Senate and when you saw how dysfunctional the United States government is?
Well, it's the age-old conflict, quite frankly, is power versus freedom. And what you see is a conflict throughout Washington of the next election's importance versus doing the right thing for the country. And that's the real pain that I see, is that's not what's happening in our country. We're making decisions about the next election cycle, not about what's in the best interest in the long term for our country. And that's human nature. I think it's worse now than what it's been in the past, partly because of the 24/7 news cycle and the more sharp partisanship that's come about because of gerrymandering of congressional districts. But the real question is what's best for America and our future? You know, anybody 40 and younger has really never experienced America at its greatest. And so they don't know what can be. And as we lose freedom, we're now number 17 in the world in terms of economic freedom. You just can't believe what a negative impact that is on our country in terms of growth, in terms of job, in terms of elevating people's salaries and standard of living. And we need to be about turning that around. And one of the reasons we can't turn it around is we have this gigantic behemoth called the U.S. federal government that limits economic freedom.
And I lied. It wasn't my last question. The president, for years, you were one of the people screaming for fiscal responsibility and cutting wasteful spending in government. President of the United States actually has put forth, I think, maybe the first budget I have seen in my lifetime that actually legitimately cuts spending at the federal level. I know you're on your book tour. You haven't had a chance to look at the details, but any reaction to that?
Yeah, the first thing I hear is everybody says, well, you can't cut Medicaid. Well, let me tell you about two states, Ohio and Pennsylvania, both compared the applications for Medicaid with auto loan applications. And they found between 300,000 and 500,000 people who lied on their Medicaid applications but were truthful about their auto loans. So that's just two states, and that's 500,000 people. So what we've done is we've created dependency, what our founders would have never tolerated, and now people cheat. And so if, in fact, you want to solve the problem and give your children a gift, let's make sure people aren't cheating. Let's make sure we have programs that help people but don't create dependency, and teach them about earned success, which will lead to happiness.
Former Senator Tom Coburn, always good to speak with you, sir. Thank you for joining us. And again, the book is Smashing the D.C. Monopoly Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom and Stop America's Runaway Government. I'm guessing our colleague here on WMAL, Mark Levin, is pretty excited about this book.
Yeah, he is. He's actually written something on the cover of the front of the book. And if you want to learn more about Convention of States, go to conventionofstates.com.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
The question facing us and facing our fellow countrymen is a two-word question. Very simply, who decides? The American founders had a simple answer. We, the people, decide.